Well, what a lovely day. It's going to be hard to follow Matt's speech, actually, but I'll do my very best. It was a great privilege to be asked by Don to speak. I'm getting some lessons here. Hold the microphone a bit closer. This is going to be difficult. As long as I don't lick it, I'll be all right. So I need to introduce myself. I think a few of you know me or know a little bit about me, but who am I? What a great question to start. Have you ever asked yourself that question? Who am I? How do you define yourself? That's tricky. I'm a thrice married man. I'm a father of 3, including to my son Jack here, my beloved son, upon whom my favour sometimes rests. And if you want to sell your house and you want photographs taken, I'm told he's the best man in Bath to do it, so talk to him later. Okay, well, little known fact about me, I was offered a job by Jacques Cousteau. Well, I didn't take it, but that's another story. I was one of the UK's first professional pollution inspectors. At 25, I was supervising emergency teams for fire and police. I'd get a knock at the front door and there'd be a copper outside with a car with a flashing light on top to escort me to yet another tanker on its side in the middle of the road, gushing a clear, colourless liquid, and to fires. I've been to all sorts of fires, seen a man kick his way out of the back of a van when he was sandwiched between a petrol tanker and a white spirit tanker that was hairy. The road melted. There was about 3-foot dip in the road for some weeks. Spillages, threatening public supply boreholes, Buntsfield, rather Slough oil terminal on fire at the time. I've seen events that have killed thousands of fish. Yeah, I never had a telephone box to change into, but I felt that I needed to. I owned and ran a partnership producing 300 tons of trout a year. And I've worked in the nuclear industry, and I still consult internationally. So those are the things I've been paid for. Do they define me? Well, I don't think so. What have I done that I haven't been paid for? I built, with a group of friends, a timber frame barn up in Herefordshire. We cut all the trees down. We converted all the timber using all the old techniques, and I learned what it's like to be bottom dog. I wasn't top dog. As you pull the saw down, you get covered in sawdust. So that's why everybody wants to be the top dog. There's only one joint in the whole barn that has got a mistake, and that's one that I cut. But so there you are, there's a distinction. So that doesn't define me either, I don't think. Do our spiritual gifts define us? I don't know. One of mine's leadership. I've been responsible for the UK's 3rd largest nuclear site. Had a staff of 600. I was responsible for 900 more, and I was spending £55 million a year. I was asked by the UK government as just one of 3 irregulars, English irregulars, to join an American team to set up the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. I was asked by the UN to teach decommissioning of the Iraqi nuclear sites, 20 of them, to the Iraqis. I've been part of an international team working for the UN, looking at leadership in severe accidents following Fukushima. I'm a home group leader, privileged to be so. I conceived and, along with others in the room, brought into being the Dress for Dignity campaign when I was chair of Robin Hood Ministries. But this all sounds like achievements, so who am I? These aren't going to count for much when I get to heaven. I am, as Matt said, a follower of Jesus Christ. Not very good follower yet. I'm certainly not in the same league as other speakers that you've had. I'm not a prophet like Roy Peacock or an evangelist like Richard Merrion, or a prayer like Don Latham, or a networker like Matt Bird. I guess I'm more of a Forrest Gump, really. Have you heard that joke about Forrest Gump? Yeah, the one where he dies and he arrives at the pearly gates and St. Peter says to him, "Forrest, we've been expecting you. Come on in." And Forrest is just about to step over the threshold and St. Peter says, "Hang on a moment. Sorry, I've forgotten. There's a little 3-question test you've got to pass before you can come in now." So the first one is, how many days of the week have got a T in them? And Forrest thinks for a while and he says, "Well, I guess that'll be today and tomorrow." And St. Peter smiles a little and he says, "Well, and for the second one, a little more difficult, how many seconds in a year?" And Forrest scratches his head for a while and he says, "Wow, that'll be 12. And St. Peter says, "Well, how do you work that out?" He said, "Well, there's January the 2nd, there's February the 2nd. And then he says, "Okay, third question, what's God's first name?" And Forrest straight away says, "Wow, that's the easiest question of them all. It's Andy." Andy? How do you work that out? Well, it's like the hymn goes, "Andy walks with me, Andy talks with me." So I can't say the Lord walks and talks with me. What I'm about to say, I might need help with. You can talk to me later, see if you can offer me some help. But I feel sometimes like I live in the same house as the Lord. And he's wandering around, he's there somewhere. I never actually see him. I yell out to him quite a lot, and once in a while I come down and I find a note on the kitchen table. That's how it feels. So, before I get properly into my talk, the postcard. You've all got one of these. It was just in case you missed the message. So this is a painting done about 100 years ago by a chap called Maurice Retsch. And he did it as an illustration for Goethe's Faust. And you can see Mephistopheles on the left there, looking like he's won. And there's Faust on the right, looking pretty downcast. And I guess the angel's not looking too pleased about things either. And there's a story of this. This is now in a private collection. It's only a little thing, about 15 inches by a foot. But it's now in a private collection sold by Christie's, and for a while it hung in the Louvre. And there's a story of a grand master going to the Louvre and looking at this and studying it for a while, and then exclaiming, "It's not lost. They've translated it wrongly. It's not checkmate. The king has one more move." So, a little, I'm going to use that refrain a bit as I go through. So I was born like everybody else. And I grew up, and one of my first spiritual memories, this makes people laugh usually, was being in a school and listening to all the kids singing All Things Bright and Beautiful. It was lovely. I can still remember it today. And then the teacher put I think it must have been a sheet up on the wall, and we watched a very grainy Technicolor story of the Good Samaritan. And I thought, I'd like to be like the Good Samaritan. So I guess that's where it all started. Thank you, Jack. I went to school and was confirmed, and I think I felt a tingling when the bishop laid his hands on me. Yeah, that was my conversion experience, I'd say. But I then spent, apart from trying to convert everybody in the quadrangle at school and having a very dim time of it, you know, as Stuart says, you never convert anybody by reasoning. You've got to leave it to the Holy Spirit. So I was pretty on fire, but then I began stepping away. Why was that? Well, you know, I was a product of the school system, wasn't I? Arrogant, probably unfeeling. My beard was growing. I knew what girls were. I really liked girls. Then I got a motorbike. I made sure that I passed my driving test at 17, both of them, the motorbike and the car, first time. He must have been blind, but anyway. I was a crack shot. I shot at Bisley. I did a couple of those sort of cold it things, you know, like when your parents don't want you to go out, you wait for them to go to sleep and you plump the pillow up in the bed and shin down the drain pipe and all that sort of thing. My mother was quite shocked when I told her about that. I did a bit of mountaineering. I had a steady girlfriend. And as it says in James, we are enticed by the world, and it's our desires that entice us and take us away. So I had a time apart, and this was my time working for the Pollution Authority, and I certainly thought that I was invincible. I had a couple of near scrapes. Some interesting stories, like the day I walked over a refuse tip that I'd walked over several times before to take a sample somewhere, and the ground literally opened up underneath me and left me hung on the edge of a very crumbly crater with nobody else about. And the snag was, I was wearing a pair of waders and they all filled up with refuse liquor. It was a bit of a hairy moment, but I guess the Lord had other plans for me. Did you all come to Matt Bird's talk on relationology? I thought it was a great word that he'd invented, but we were doing it 30 years ago with stakeholder involvement and things like that. It was a time when I learnt that people's opinions really do matter. So I was away from the Lord. So what was the journey back? Well, it went something like this. I got married to a childhood sweetheart, and she had an uncle who was provost of Sheffield Cathedral, so naturally he took the wedding and he gave us as a text that bit in Joshua 24. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And that sort of sunk in for some reason. And I was doing up a house in Berkhamsted, and a time of relative peace and prosperity was starting for me. I was digging away on an allotment, listening to the church bells each Sunday, and I began to say grace at meal times. I didn't know necessarily who to, but it seemed a very right thing to do. And then I found that our first son was on the way. That was a bit of a surprise. Delighted, he was born, and my then wife was training as a GP, and she was spending a lot of time with her GP trainer. And then to make house calls a bit easier, she started staying overnight at his place. He was a widower, and the next thing I knew, I was left on my own with my son, aged 7 months old. I don't know if that's happened to any of you, but it's quite a kick in the slats, as they say. It was very hard to come back from. I struggled on my own in Amersham for a few months, and then finally gave in and went home to my parents and to get my mother to show me properly to do what with which end, you know. Anyway, I began to go to church again, and I'd offered God that deal. You know how you offer God deals? give me my wife back and I'll believe in you. Well, do you know what? He didn't give me my wife back. I learned that you can pray all you like, but actually a person's relationship is their own before God. You can ask for spiritual space for them, but in the end, they make their own decisions. But I'd started to read the Bible again. Why was that? I guess I liked its values. Seemed right. And I was reading every night, and I can remember being stood having a pee and thinking, what shall I read tonight? And then, quick as a flash, into my mind came Jeremiah 42. So much so I nearly wet the carpet. But I looked up Jeremiah 42, and it said, if you're willing to go on living in this land, then I will build you up. I won't tear you down. It was a great message at the time. So I had a difficult time. It was a very, very difficult time. No work, running out of money, running out of the goodwill of my parents. And single parenting's tough. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And if you're a fella, it's doubly tough. But the king had one more move. So very shortly after that, just as things were particularly low, do you remember that bit in Lamentations 3, which says, I've forgotten what the good life's like. I said to myself, this is it. I'm finished. God is a lost cause. That's exactly how I was feeling. But as I said, God had one more move. My neighbours went to Australia for 6 months and left me, my parents' neighbours, left me house sitting. That was fantastic. I was still low on cash, and rather defiantly, I put my last £100 in the collection with well, there you are, God. 2 days later, I had a cheque from the Inland Revenue for £300. Doesn't sound a lot, but it's worth about 1,200 quid then. And then my house in Chesham sold, a house in the village came up, and a job came along too. And what was really remarkable about this was that it was a job I thought I was unqualified for. It was to work at a nuclear establishment as a water management consultant. But the strange thing was, and this is where God's so perfect, isn't he? The one thing that they wanted was somebody who knew the subject but knew nothing about the nuclear industry, was, as they described it, unsullied by the nuclear industry. Because they didn't have a safety committee. Safety standards had slumped. It was a good time for me to join. And there I met Jack's mother, and that was absolutely lovely. She's given me 2 lovely children, him and his sister Ruth. But we subsequently divorced. Should we have got married? What happens at sort of crossroads in life? How does the Lord lead us? And the point of this little bit of a story is just to, by the way, I can't answer that question. I'm absolutely delighted we did. I wouldn't have either of them today otherwise. And I learnt a lot. But a truth teller came to see me. One of those ordinary people that you're in fellowship with. And she said to me, Mark, I know Jane's said that she's going to make a commitment, but she hasn't yet. And you shouldn't yoke yourself with unbelievers. That's what it says in 2 Corinthians. And I said, well, Sue, I'm sorry, it's all too late now, and I love her anyway, so, but I'd encourage you, if we're supposed to be a band of brothers, fellas, not supposed to sit around just patting each other on the head and issuing platitudes. Jesus never did that. We are a community. And it says in Hebrews, I rather like this bit from the Message. So watch your step, friends. For as long as it's still God's today, keep each other on your toes so sin doesn't slow down your reflexes. We're in this with Christ for the long haul. So I started doing home group. That was great. And getting into the Word. I was told I should get into the Word. But where were Jane and I going to live? How was that going to work out? We needed a new start. And the King had one more move. Because the house next door to my parents, which I couldn't afford, became ours. The woman had taken a liking to me for some reason, offered it at the price I could afford, and we moved in. It was absolutely fabulous. And during that process of buying, I made a commitment to God that I would rename it from Cherry Tree Cottage to Eliezer Cottage, because as you all know, Eliezer means God helps me. I'm pleased to say it's still called that today. And I started having some great experiences. The first was that my grandmother was clearly about to die sometime in the next year. And I was concerned about this. I loved her. And I mentioned this to the home group. And somebody said, I think you're going to be given a word for her. What's a word? Oh, okay. So I started looking out for the word, and along it came. I was absolutely certain when I read it. It was one morning, it was that bit in 1 Corinthians talking about food offered to idols. And I thought, wow, this sounds like it, but what's this got to do? I went to see my grandmother, and I said, Gran, do you mind if I read you a bit from the Bible? And she said, as grandmas do, no dear. So I read it to her, and I sort of sat back, and she didn't say anything, and I said, well? She said, you read that very nicely, darling. And I stumbled downstairs knowing, as you do, that was going to be the last time I saw her. And I bumped into the matron of the nursing home at the bottom, who'd given me a right roasting the week before for keeping my grandmother too long. And I blurted this story out to you. And she said, why? We were only talking with Mrs. Culver yesterday about food offered to idols. So there we are. So, trying to read my notes here. I want to just digress slightly into the seen and the unseen. You've probably all read that Francis Schaeffer book, Death in the City. If you haven't, it's a good read. I'd recommend it. And in the book, he talks about 3 men in an airplane, and they're going to take off. It's all pretty hairy stuff. And there's a pagan, an engineer, and the Christian. This isn't a joke. Sorry. But the pagan is scared. He knows all about the unseen as well, because he worships demons. And the engineer knows everything there is to know about the plane, but he doesn't know anything about the unseen. And the Christian knows about both. But what Schaeffer says is, but what about you as the Christian? If you say the universe has a spiritual dimension and yet do not live like it, you are acting as though you know less than the pagan. You're sat in the materialist chair, in other words. And as Schaeffer would put it, you are in unfaith. My challenge, I guess, this morning to me as well as to you is, are you in unfaith? Do you believe, yet you're not acting as though you believe? So my first strides back to the Lord, properly back to the Lord, were being given a job in London, doubling my salary, and getting a 1 3/4 hour one-way commute to London, and then 1 3/4 of an hour on the way back. You can do a lot of reading in that time. And I had a bad back and was just about to start a big house extension, and really, really grim. I tried everything to get rid of this back. I was absolutely crippled by it, wondering where to turn. I tried doctors, I tried going to bed after half a bottle of wine, you know, all that sort of stuff. But I'm pleased to say the king had one more move. And our property was ringed by a track. We were living in the middle of 7,000 acres of common land, a lovely setting. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, all around this track were some dogs baying. Never happened before or since. But I had a sheep on the tether in the garden at the time, doing a bit of grass cutting. And I thought, poor sheep, and I shot out of bed, rushed downstairs, pulled my trousers on, and then realized I had absolutely no pain at all. And that had followed being prayed for at church that evening. The king had had one more move. Then I got good news and bad news from my employer, the CEGB at the time. The good news, they told me, was I still had a job. The bad news was it was in Bristol. We had a whole, I was living at Newbury at the time, I forgot to say that important bit. Would we go? Would we stay? Life was good where we were, but it needed a job. And I began to realize that God speaks to us 3 times. Is that other people's experience? Any nods around the room? Yeah? And 3 times I got that bit in Deuteronomy to Joshua, be strong and courageous, for the Lord your God goes with you, and he will never leave nor forsake you. And the king had one more move because he had to. We went to sell the house and we couldn't do it. The lord of the manor, who owned all the common land, claimed a ransom strip. And this is how I got to know my dear friend Peter here 21 years ago. I bought his house. We're still speaking. Just. And it took a year to do, a very heavy, hairy year for both of us. And I was beginning to learn, as it says in Matthew, with all things, with God, all things are possible. And interestingly, I think God's interested in 3 things in our lives. Who we marry, what work we do, and where we will live. So those are absolutely top things to pray about and to expect an answer for. And then oddly, in that period of prosperity, the wilderness years started. Work was good, busy, church okay, home group not so good, things were settled domestically. But then the king had another move. I was suddenly offered out of the job, out of the blue, a job as a nuclear site inspector. It was so big. And I was no physicist at the time, no engineer, so I was going to refuse it. And then 3 times, in various ways, that bit in Judges came to me. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Well, hang on a moment, I thought. And then the other bit in just a few pages on, where it says, "Who am I, my Lord? I am the least among my clan and my family." But on the basis of having had this word from the Lord, I took the job. Can you imagine that? That's a very dodgy way of becoming a nuclear site inspector, isn't it? However, they trained me up well, and I had I have to say, a great aptitude for the job. And I did that for a few years and then was appointed director of the Berkeley site. And I thought, Lord, thank you. This is my show that you've given me to run. I'm going to run it along your lines. And the first thing I did was cancel Sunday overtime. Do you think people were delighted? No. Wow, what a storm that raised. But a few weeks later, I was having people's wives come up to me in the street and saying, I'd forgotten what he looked like. Thank you. And then later on, the fellas themselves really pleased about the change. And you know, I found that leadership was a servant role. If anybody tries to kid you otherwise, don't believe them. It was busy. It was busy. I wasn't spending as much time at home as I would have liked to have done. And then I had another one of those 3 times. And it was about the story of the 2 builders, the wise and the foolish. And the wise man is the man who built his house on rock, on the words of Jesus. And I remember saying to Peter one night, I've had this 3 times. Oh, feels like there's a storm coming. And boy, there was. Shortly afterwards, I discovered my wife was having an affair. And I forgave her. But then she had another one, and I thought, enough's enough. And I took the let-out clause for Christians in Matthew 19, which allows divorce for adultery. Not a happy time. Not a happy time for any of us. And then I had to sell the family home. And where were we going to live? And I'm pleased to say that the king had one more move. Because we were found bought and sold in 7 weeks to a lovely house in Greenway Lane. And we moved in, and you know, God must have known something. Because 2 or 3 weeks later, I was made redundant. Why do I look so pleased about that? Because I'd taken a hit for being a Christian at work, I think, but I did have a payoff, and that helped with the finances at the time. And then I had a phone call from the Department of Trade and Industry offering me this job in London, and I discovered that the Lord had given me a house with just a 15-minute walk to the station. Imagine if I'd been like Ernie, living in Weston. Tough. But there we are. And then some very amazing things started to happen. I thought, I'm well off enough now that when this job comes to an end, I can do 3 days paid and 2 days charity work. I'd like to do that, Lord. I'd like to keep pouring that oil if I possibly can. And I went to a spiritual gifts course, a Kaleo course. Well, Stuart's done one recently. Tim in the room somewhere's just done one. And it was amazing. I discovered, yes, I'd got the gift of leadership, that I'm also quite good with children. And I was asked to make a commitment at the end. And I said, I'm going to be careful here. I'm making a promise in front of the Lord. So I said, I commit to finding out about this organization that works with orphanages in Romania called Robin Hood Ministries. And I handed over to the woman to right of me to say her statement, closing statement. And she looked straight back at me and she said, why? I'm a trustee of that charity. So I was hooked. So I was working for Robin Hood Ministries as their chair, but still, and God does this, doesn't he? He tests us. Expect to be tested by the Lord. Not all tests are from the Lord, but some are. And I had to wait for the 3 days paid. And then I got an invitation, that was very good, and on we went. And you learn in the wilderness. You learn in the wilderness time. And it's a time where you can do some scriptural reprogramming. Don't reprogram any other way. I had time for reflection. I can remember being in Greece doing some work on myself, as it were, writing down some of the things that had happened to me and discovering that there was a bit of a theme in my life, which was of making decisions that were based on an element of fear. I thought, well, I'm done with this. I'm not going to do this. And I went for a walk along the beach, met a woman with a couple of Alsatian dogs, and I'd had a very bad do with an Alsatian when I was 18 that had me by the throat. Not very nice experience. And I was walking along the beach, and as I went to walk away, one of these dogs bit me on the ankle. And anyway, I carried on. I walked along up on the headland and thinking about this fear thing. And I looked down, and it was about 40 feet up, rocks at the bottom, etc. And I thought, I've had enough of this. I'm scared of going back. I can't go on. I'm scared of jumping off. What am I most scared about? Jumping off the cliff. So I jumped off, swam around. Fantastic. That was quite a turning point, really. God is interested in our heart attitudes. Do you know that? That's why Jesus was so unpopular. He challenged the teaching of the Torah, this idea that you can live by the strict letter of the law. So, heart attitudes, we need to watch those. So, I'm getting in the groove. And actually getting a bit fed up of being on my own. It was okay. I did some dating, met some nice people, had an interesting time, but I felt that it wasn't right. And I said to the Lord, okay, singledom, that's fine by if that's what you want, that's fine by me. And then a couple of weeks later, I was around with Julian at Don's, and we were praying about something. And you know, Don's quite a prayer. Did you know that? And we left to go, and he said to me, Mark, we've not prayed for you. I said, well, I haven't got anything to pray about. Thanks, Don. That's okay. And he said, no, we should pray for something. Come on, give me something. And you know what it's like when you're put on the spot. You blurt something out. And I said, life's in a bit of a mess, Don. And he adopted the shampoo position, looked up a couple of minutes later and said, I think you're going to meet somebody very soon. And you all know the story then about how I met my lovely wife, Rebecca, because the king had had one more move. So we were married within the year, settling down, planning what we were going to do, got a garden plan all worked out, you know, everything. But the king had one more move. I went to Vienna to deliver a paper that I'd been asked to write, and after I'd been there a couple of days, somebody said, would you like a job? And I said, well, no thanks. Well, come on, you haven't heard what it is yet. And I said, no, that's okay, no thanks. Well, come on, you're a bit closed-minded, aren't you? Do you want to know what it is? So I said, all right, well, tell me then. It's working with the Iraqi government. I said, well, no thanks, definitely not. And I booked for Rebecca to come out at the weekend, and she came out, and we were having a lovely time. We were walking through the centre of Vienna, and I was telling her about this story. And incidentally, I was telling her about how I'd had an email from Val Huxley on the Thursday saying, I don't know why I'm sending you this, Mark, but I've just been reading an extract from J. John about a John Ortberg book. If you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat. And the key thing about that story is that Peter got out of the boat. He was the only one who got out of the boat. You might think of him as being a failed water walker, but the rest of them were just boat potatoes. But the thing was, he went because Jesus said, come. So there we were. I'd refused this job, but the king had one more move because Rebecca said to me, I thought you promised me that all the big decisions we were going to pray about. I said, of course I did, darling. Of course we will. And she said, well, you've just made one without me. How's that work? She said, well, you've said no to a job. I said, well, we're just passing Stephenstone Cathedral. Let's go in and consult the Lord. And we came out, and the important thing is what the Lord said to her, because we were walking along the street, and I said, yes? Oh, odd, she said. All I could remember, and she didn't know about this email that had come from Val, was a story about a John Ortberg book. If you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat. Well, wow. Oh, that's only twice, Lord. That's okay, only twice. So we're out for dinner in the evening, and we're just on the way to a restaurant I'd been shown, and passing Peterskirche, just off Stephansplatz. And I said, darling, I know we're late, but we've got to go in. We've got to look at this ceiling in here. Wonderful, ornate, Baroque ceiling. And we're rushing to go out of the door because we are late. And you know how when you're focused on going out of the door, that's all you're interested in. You don't want to be, particularly if you're bald, bashing your head on anything. And all I can say is I felt compelled to look up. And there was a painting up there above the door. Do you know what it was? Peter getting out of the boat. You've got it right. So 5 weeks later, we were 2 houses let, and I was looking for somewhere in Vienna. But these things don't come at without personal cost. And there is a tack. And pretty soon afterwards, I got laid low with a very bad bout of septicemia and cellulitis. Very, very bad, actually. I tried to keep it to myself, as you do. And then Rebecca persuaded me to send a photograph, and she, as a nurse, said, well, this is pretty dodgy. You're going to lose your leg if you're not careful. And I was already on antibiotics and all that sort of stuff. And being a good wife, you know that bit in Ecclesiastes 3, which talks about how 2 are better than 1. Well, she invoked the prayer chain at Holy Trinity. I think the WI were involved, and I'm sorry, it sounds a tall story, but it's absolutely true that the next morning the leg was significantly better. The king had had another move. So the story could go on and on and on. I mean, one more is that we started the Dress for Dignity campaign in Vienna. If you don't know about it, look it up, but it's an event for women. We had 23 models of 17 different nationalities lined up. It was all going well, but we didn't have a venue. The Viennese, they don't do charity in the same way as we do over here. No venue. And I was just off to Australia. We were walking down the road, and Rebecca said to me, well, what are we going to do for a venue? And because I was on the way to Australia, I just said to her, well, darling, I know you're staying behind, but don't worry, the Lord will provide. Can you imagine how she received that? Well, it's all right for you, you're off to... She was, it was Sunday, I was catching the flight, she was on her way to church, and at the end of the church service, the British ambassador in Vienna offered his private residence for the event. The king had had yet another move. So I came back to the UK, and I was still working for Golder Associates at the time, but I was getting what I describe as having the holy fidgets. Do any of you ever get that? Something's up, you're not quite sure what's up, and I went to a 3-day meeting at headquarters. I was pretty senior with them, and as soon as I walked in, I'd been praying, Lord, should I stay with these people? If so, I've really got to knuckle down. My heart's not in this, or should I go? And for the whole of the 3 days, it was Mark, fantastic, glad you're here. Can you help us with this project? Can you do that? But the king had one more move, because on the way out, I popped in to see the MD and I said, Julian, sorry I've not had time to see you. I know things aren't going too well in the company, and I know you're on your second bout of chemotherapy. I just want you to know if there's anything that I can do for you, just let me know. And he said, well, there is actually. You can collect your cards. Just like that. And I said, okay, that's fine. Can you imagine me just saying, okay, that's fine? Well, I did. And I came home and I told Rebecca, I told her it was fine too, and she was slightly surprised. And the next morning we had a phone call, and her father had fallen over again and was in casualty, and cutting the story short, he was discharged into our care that afternoon, and I was promoted to full-time carer of Alan Newt, the well-known and renowned Bible preacher. And it was a promotion. Strange to say, the king had had another move. And then we arrived we began to think about what does honouring your mother and father look like, and we were getting fed up living in his one-bedroom flat in Bristol, and we decided it would probably be, my father now having died, providing a home for my mother and for Alan, and cutting another long story short, that's how, I can't see it, Peter, but that's 10-2, that's how we ended up in Eden House in Hallertrow. Now, a few of you have been there around the room. We're trying to keep it as an open house, to use it for events and for people needing rest and respite. So what next? Because I'm sure the king has one more move, at least. I've got into anti-trafficking somewhat. That's really caught my interest. And I've been researching it with a friend of mine, and was introduced through the UN Office of Drugs and Crime to the chap who set up the Human Trafficking Agency, or Anti-Human Trafficking Agency in the UK. It's been quite a ride, really. Did you know that if you're a victim of trafficking, you've got just a 1 in 100 chance of being rescued? Just think about that for a moment. Imagine that you're the one locked in the cellar. You're being violated, or you've been being made to work against your will in degrading circumstances. That's tough. And the other side of that coin is that if you're a trafficker in Europe, you've just a 1 in 100,000 chance of being caught and convicted. Doesn't stack up, does it? And if you think it's all women, it's not. It's the ratios in the UK are pretty much 50-50, men and women. The most heavily populated age group of victims is 20 to 30-year-olds. 50-50 sexual exploitation versus labour. It is a disgusting business. If any of you want to talk more to me about that, I'd be very happy to. So right, in conclusion, this is what you've been waiting for. I'm on a journey. I guess we're all on a journey where, what is it? It's probably from self-centeredness to God-centeredness. You remember that first commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart? That's what it's about. And he doesn't mess about, and neither should we. And it's a privilege talking to you this morning. Thanks so much for listening. And you are my brothers, whether I like it or not. We need to band together a bit more, fellas, one to the other. The person you're sat next to today, you're not sat next to by accident. There will be a divine appointment. Use it. So I say to you, live life as you want it to be. If you love openness, be open. If you love truthfulness, be truthful, and so on. if anything has struck a chord with you this morning and you'd like to talk more, I'd be happy to do so. But just remember, for you, the King has one more move.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for sharing your story with us. It's been a real encouragement and a great start to a very sunny weekend. So thank you, Mark, for sharing your story.